Hello and welcome to the Viking channel. In this episode we will focus on the travels during the Viking Age to the west. The Scandinavians were travelers even before the Viking Age. They were seafaring people. It was easier to travel over the waterways with their ships than to be traveling with a horse on the mainland. The general reasons for traveling were raiding and trading, exploring and settling. The Vikings from today's Sweden, they would go east because of the geographical location. They would travel into Russia all the way down to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. The Norwegian and the Danish Vikings, however, they would go west. The Danish Vikings would go over to England, they would go into Yorkshire, to Jorvik, today's York. And we have the first recorded attack from this time period. From the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the monks are writing about the Norsemen who are attacking them during the night. They are going to the monastery in Lindisfarne and they are killing everyone they see, and they are taking all the valuables they can from there. The Danish Vikings would then settle, they would blend into the Anglo-Saxon population, so they would stay in that area. Some of them would sail along the Atlantic coast through France, Spain, and then all the way into the Mediterranean Sea. And the name Normandy, a part of France, comes from the Norman influence, the people from the north in that area. The Norwegian Vikings, they would go further north than the Danish Vikings. They would go to the Shetland Islands, to the Orkneys. They would be part of developing and establishing Dublin. They would go to the Faroese Islands. They would eventually settle Iceland, go on to Greenland, and also to the North American continent. Leaving the Scandinavian mainland to go west, you had to go over open water. That could be dangerous, and there was also the idea that you would sail west, you will come over a cliff, and you would end up in a nothingness of some sort. In the Scandinavian mainland, there was the idea that if you were sailing west, you would eventually find land, and you would always have land to your north. It was Risaland up to the north, the land of the giants. And that made some of the Vikings going west brave enough to actually face that fear that is there something out there, but they would sail in the faith of there is land. If we get lost to the west, we can go north and we will find land. In Scandinavia proper at this time, there is an overpopulation, but we also have a stratification of power. We have petty kings who take more and more power and want to establish kingdoms. In Norway we have King Harald Finehair, who wants to be the king over united Norway. He's taking back the free land, the odal, from farmers, and he wants to give that back on his own account and to say, I will give this to you. And the farmers, or the smaller or the lower chieftains who opposed to that, they would just decide to leave Norway at the time. And they would use their ships and they would use the waterways to sail away. There was this idea of this empty island out to the west. Already 150 AD we could read about this isolated Atlantic island Thule. And if that was Iceland, we don't know, but it's probably that someone had sailed, there was an account of that, and they would set sail. The journey would not go straight from Norway to Iceland, so there was going to the Shetlands, to the Orkneys, maybe to Ireland, to Dublin, and then eventually finding Iceland, which was inhabited at the time. And in the late 9th century, the first Norwegians are coming and they are settling down. And pretty soon after the first settling, the more and more of the land was taken. And then suddenly you have the farmers, the wealthy farmers leaving the Norwegian mainland, taking with them the idea that they're opposing to the stratification of power. They're opposing that they would have one king who united Norway. They would go to Iceland to create something new where they would settle. But very soon after the settlement, you needed rules, you needed laws, you needed order. So you have a society without a central organization. So how do you handle a society like that? It's a question of honor and revenge. They are the driving forces in this society. And soon after, already 930, the first parliament was established in Iceland. This is actually the world's oldest, still functioning parliament, not in the same location, but it's still called the same thing, the Alþingi. And they met once every year to settle disputes and to recite the law, because there were no written sources at this time, so you had a law speaker who would tell the law. So soon after the settlement, leaving something they were opposing to, you are back in the same system where you have law and you have order and you have ways of how to handle disputes. But there is no king. So you have the chieftains, and then they are trying to get more and more power. On a side note, the language the ones who left Norway would bring with them to Iceland was called Old Norse, or Danish tongue, Dansk tunga. They would bring that with them, and of course, going to Iceland at that time, it's very isolated. It's in the North Atlantic, so the language became very intact, and it didn't go through the same changes as the language did on the Scandinavian mainland, where you had the influence of, in the Middle Ages, from German, eventually from French and English. So today, modern Icelandic is not exactly the same language as in the Viking Age, but it's close enough. So a native speaker of Icelandic can read the manuscripts, and the manuscripts are from the early 13th century. In the late 10th century, there is a Norwegian farmer, Erik the Red, who was outlawed from Norway because he had killed someone. When you're outlawed, you have to leave the country, otherwise you have no protection. So Erik the Red took his family and they went to Iceland, and they managed to settle in one of the valleys. And one of his sons was Leif Eriksson. They set it up in Dalir, in Eriksstadir, and there was a fight, and Erik just happened to kill another man and was outlawed again. Now he couldn't go back to Norway, and what do? You live at the outskirts of the known world. So he had this idea, I will sail further west, and in that way he discovered and went to Greenland. There had been seafarers who passed by or been blown off course earlier and would come back and say that they had seen this new coastline and they weren't sure about what that was. Erik was brave enough to go around the tip of Greenland, and he established first one settlement, and eventually there were two on the western coast of the southern tip of Greenland. The outlawry was over after 3 years, and then he went back to Iceland because he thought this would be very profitable to stay here. The climate was different, land was arable, so when he went back to Iceland, he tried to recruit new members, and he called this new land Greenland because that was more tempting than to say something else. So you have this idea of green pastures and farming and living a good life. And he did get new people with him to this new colony. According to the Vinland sagas, there is a man, Bjarni Herjolfsson, in Norway. He's going to go and visit his father in Iceland. He sails to Iceland and he asks for his father. And he was told that, he moved away to Greenland. So Bjarni needs to set sail, and he needs to sail to find his father in Greenland. There is a storm, he's blown off course, and he comes to a long course, and he's sailing along the course, and he says, no, this is not what I heard Greenland would be. Eventually, he can find his way to go back, and he comes to Greenland, finds his father, talks about his adventures. And this is again the time of exploring and settling. A young man, Leif Eriksson, he's very tempted. He hears about these stories and he knows that Bjarni didn't go ashore. So he tells his father Erik, let's go on this adventure. Erik says he's too old and he doesn't want to go with Leif, but he's convinced to do so. On the way to the boat, to the ship, he stumbles and he says, no, I'm going back home. So Leif Eriksson, with his crew then, they leave Greenland and they sail west. And they're passing along the course and they're coming to the first place, which is bare, and they call it Hetleland. The third place they're passing by, it's forested, so he says this is Markland. And finally they come to another place which looks more nicer, greener, not so many trees, but a more arable land. And they stop there, and this is the place in Lands or Meadows, which is the very tip in New Finland, facing the Atlantic Ocean. According to the sagas, Leif settled there with his crew members, all the people he brought with him. They are there for a few years, and in the sagas he calls it Leif's Budir. Today there is actually an excavation, so we know that there was a base camp, and it's not a permanent settlement because the houses are placed right on an open ocean. And for security and safety reasons, no one would permanently settle right on an open ocean. You had no protection. But as a base camp, it works well. You would come with your ships, you would unload your cargo, or you would load cargo and go away. There are no traces whatsoever of any other settlements, not yet. There might be. We just don't know where they are. It's one of these mysteries. Where did the Norsemen go after having unloaded their cargo in Lands or Meadows? But according to the sagas, they did have interaction with the native inhabitants. Of course, they couldn't communicate with the language, but they had some trading going back and forth. And Leif Eriksson and his crew, they would bring cattle over, so they had milk, dairy product, and that would be tempting for the native inhabitants. In the sagas, they are called skrailing, which is an Old Norse word for just describing someone who is different, not looking like them, not speaking the same language. And in the beginning, according to the saga, things go well, but there is a clash, maybe misreading the culture codes. And that led to Leif Eriksson taking all his people with him, and he went back to Greenland, and he told about his adventure there. A few more expeditions we know about from the sagas went over, and after the saga period, after the Viking Age, some trading ships might have been going back and forth, but again, we don't know. All of these western travels from Greenland on, it's a mystery. And it's one of these interesting mysteries, and hopefully one day we will have some answers. Travels we do know more about, however, are the travels to the east, and that is something I will talk about in the next episode.